Now let's come to the problems in the working of NGOs. I think this question appeared this year in the mains also. And there was another sub part of the question was that can civil society and civil society organization become a true alternative paradigm of governing the country, almost to the point of eclipsing the state, eclipsing the market also. That part we'll discuss as we go along. But then one part of the question was that what are the problems and challenges faced by NGOs and voluntary associations and civil society organizations, right? So let's talk about the problems of NGOs. The first is the obvious one, that is deficiency of resources, right? To that extent, they often have to secure resources from outside the country also. And then when they try to do so, and especially those NGOs which are somewhat critical of the government's policies, so then the government cracks down on them also, suspends their FCRA licenses, registration, etc., and then makes it difficult for them to access resources. But that is something which has been happening now. But in general, of course, most NGOs, they suffer from deficiency of resources. Acha. In India, till about 1990-91, when the new economic reforms were inaugurated and private sector started coming up in a big way in those days, that started happening after 1991. Up to that point, private sector was not a very huge presence in the country. Most of the things were nationalized. A lot of public sector units were operating in a number of areas. Practically most of the areas of human endeavor, you would have found some kind of a PSU over there, right? So, and the country's economy was heavily closed. It was difficult to procure resources from outside in general. Now, so it is still somewhat easier, but very difficult in the pre-economic liberalization time, the era before liberalization, right? Achha, to this extent, what used to happen was that many of the NGOs of those days, which used to start with a very radical objective, radical agenda of transforming the society, introducing a socialistic pattern of society, social re-engineering, very radical agendas they came up with, right? And they were critical, outrightly critical of the government also. But the problem was because they lacked resources, many of these NGOs which started with initially very radical agendas also, they eventually came to depend on financial support from the government only. Now the problem is that when you have a radical agenda, which makes you overly critical of what the government is doing and government's policies, but the moment you start taking money from the government, you have to tone it down, then you have to tone down the criticism. You have to also, dilute your so-called radicalness of your agenda also. So this is actually what happened pre-1990, that many of these NGOs which started with some very idealistic intentions and objectives with a very radical agenda in mind, but eventually because they came to acquire a lot of, seek a lot of support from the government, they had to dilute, they lost their radical edge, so to speak. And because when the government gives you funds, government will also interfere in the way in which the NGO functions. So it led to another very interesting situation that many NGOs who, whether you like it or not, had to depend upon government funding. In the process, they lost their radical edge also. And then, as I said that, because of the fact that the government would interfere in their functioning regularly, they also became increasingly government-like. So to speak, their internal operations also became almost as bureaucratized and rule-driven as perhaps was the government departments and government agencies themselves. So one, because of government financial support, they lost their radical edge, and many of them also became increasingly bureaucratic in their functioning. Achha, now thankfully, this has changed over the last 3 decades. With the rise of corporate sector, many of the NGOs, instead of seeking funds from your government directly, they try to seek funds from business houses, big rich donors, big landlords or big business houses, etc. So their dependence on the government has come down appreciably. And with the opening up of the economy, now the NGOs are also allowed to secure funds from outside. But of course, this has been made more and more difficult in the recent past. But at least there is an option available. You can get resources from outside as well, right? So what the NGOs displayed a tendency towards increasing dependence on resources on the government. That has come down today. Many of the NGOs which were started with a very radical agenda, they had to compromise on that radical agenda because of government support. But over the last 3 decades, support from the government has come down in the sense that the NGOs' reliance on just one entity in the society, that is government, for resources has come down appreciably, right? So, but yes, even then, most of the NGOs, if you ask them, what is the key problem that they face in implementing whatever objectives and ideals with which they have been created, they say this is the first problem they will cite, that is deficiency of resources, right? Secondly, uneven presence. Now, this question which came in the mains also, can civil society become an alternative paradigm of governance? Alternative paradigm of governance means that the government is wound up, the market is wound up, and eventually the whole country is run by self-supporting voluntary associations, NGOs, people's organizations, citizen-centric organizations. So that is not a possibility, right? That it becomes, when you say that, it becomes the only alternative. So that will never happen. But can it become one of the alternative problem-solving fora? It has already become one, right? But then, the uneven presence aspect is that we don't find NGOs and voluntary associations being formed and operating in all parts of the country. They have their limited networks, limited infrastructure. So to that extent, they cannot have their presence everywhere, right? And the uneven presence argument also goes like this. There are certain so-called fashionable locations which become overpopulated with NGOs. So when that Niamgiri episode occurred with respect to the Vedanta mines, you probably are familiar with that, right? So where the government was about to give a specific mound over there for mining of aluminium ore over there, and then eventually Supreme Court also intervened. Niamgiri tribals also got together, and then finally, the tribals were able to ensure that Vedanta was not given the mining rights over there, right? But then that was a time when a lot of NGOs flocked to that place. They are still operating in that area. So we see that there are several parts of our country where there is practically no presence of NGOs, while there are always certain so-called fashionable locations, that the example I gave of Niamgiri Hills, which tend to become overpopulated with NGOs, right? So the second problem is their uneven presence across the country. They are not uniformly present across the country, or their activities are not conducted all over the country, right? Then next, the lack of coordination and cooperation. Now here I am talking about lack of coordination and cooperation as between the various NGOs. Now see here, especially the NGOs which are working in the same area, not the same territorial area, same area of human activity. Like two NGOs are working in the same area, like rural housing, or the same area like providing primary health services, or basic education, or skill training, or vocational training, etc., etc., right? So if there are two NGOs which are working in the same area, ideally they should cooperate. They should also pool in their resources. They should also pool in their basic staff. That would help them in acquiring economies of scale, also reduce their housekeeping expenditures. Once they do that, once they collaborate and coordinate, and they also pool their resources, and both human as well as financial resources, they'll be able to reduce, they'll be able to check duplication of activities, wastage of funds, etc. But the problem is that instead of having a cooperative attitude towards your fellow brothers who are working in the other NGOs and coordinating your efforts with them, we find there is rivalry and competition. Ultimately every NGO wants to rise in the estimation of the donors, and every NGO does not want to share the credit for its achievements with any other NGO, because when an NGO is when reports about an NGO success are reported in various national and international journals, so then that catches the eyes of various donors, also various international organizations, which give them all kinds of awards and prizes, etc. So because of this fact that every NGO wants to take the credit, this is a problem, right? This is, after all, NGOs are also populated by humans only, and humans suffer from the same kind of frailties of ego, of sometimes narcissism, so on, so to speak. And this is a ubiquitous phenomena which characterizes humans everywhere, right? So as opposed to coordinating and cooperating with each other, even those NGOs which work in the same sector, there is a spirit of rivalry, spirit of competition. Some healthy competition is okay, but when the competition reaches a point that you're not willing to cooperate and coordinate at all, in the vain hope that finally you should be able to claim credit for whatever achievements you are making, or otherwise if you cooperate and coordinate your efforts with others, then you will have to share that credit. You want your NGO to win all kinds of international awards and being reported in international and other kinds of important journals, etc. So this leads to a spirit of competition and in fact cutthroat competition of the kind you normally associate with the corporate structures, right? So any which way, lack of coordination and cooperation as between various NGOs. Then they have a limited outreach and network, and this is related to obviously deficiency of resources. This and this point are obviously contextually related, right? Deficiency of resources, which leads to limited outreach and network, so they cannot cover the whole country, and that leads to uneven presence as well, right? Now look at the fifth point: shortage of trained and dedicated workers. See, if the NGO is operating in an area of development, advancement, etc., there is some element of technicality involved in every developmental effort. You require, therefore, trained workers, dedicated workers. My question is this, that how many youngsters in this country who are engineers, doctors, or chartered accountants, or lawyers, etc., who would want to spend their entire life in the service of some kind of an NGO? I mean, many people, they join the NGO for a few years, and finally, they just quit after two, 3 years. Their objective was basically to get some experience in the working of an NGO, and then they can also put this in they can decorate their resume. They can very well add in the resume that you worked with an NGO for a long time, 2, 3 years. That can help you, that can improve your employability, that can help you in negotiating a better salary package with whatever company you finally take up your job with, right? So there is a lack of trained and dedicated workers. And even though you see that there are so many NGOs in this country, there are so many pressure groups in the country also, but don't get confused over here when I say this thing, that NGO and pressure group activity in India on a per capita basis, if I say it on a per capita basis, is still on a very, very low scale, still on a very, very low ebb. You would say that, sir, there are so many pressure groups in the country, thousands of them, right? There are thousands and lakhs of NGOs which have been created. And here I am saying that pressure group and NGO activity is still on a low ebb. The point is this. I have a lot of friends in in Western Europe. I have a lot of friends in England, a lot of friends who are relatives living in America also. And when I talk to them, so if I generally talk to any of the family members over there who are related to me, so I ask them, what do you do on weekends? He says, I have a meeting in this club, I have a meeting of that group in which I participate. I find that most of them are part of some kind of citizens-based organizations, whether sports clubs or recreational clubs, or whether some kind of a basic club for basic association for discussing some important issues. There are some library book reading clubs also, right? In India, if I ask you also, people who are listening to my lectures, how many of you are actually a member of any, when I say member, I mean that you are an actual working operative member of an NGO or a pressure group. I mean, the answer, when I asked this question in my regular classes also, hardly 2 or 3 hands stood up, and I believe those hands also stood up in the way that, they were just members of some NGOs, but they were not actively participating in their activities, well, because they were preparing for civil services, right? So, on the whole, yes, you will see that there is an explosion of pressure groups in the country, there has been an explosion of NGOs, but on a per capita basis, you find, how many people do you find every day in your life? Ask these questions to your friends and relatives and family members, that are they a member of any pressure group or NGO? 9 times out of 10, the answer would be no. So, in that sense, pressure group and NGO activity in our country, even though there has been an explosion of it, it is still on a per capita basis on a very low ebb, right? And when it is on a low ebb, one of the big factors is that NGOs also require dedicated and trained professionals for the kind of work that they are doing. And they suffer from this acute shortage of trained human resources, right? So, shortage of trained dedicated workers, and plus keep this statement in mind that in spite of the explosion of NGOs and pressure groups in India, pressure group and NGO activity in India is still on a low ebb when you look at the size of our population of roughly 135-140 crores, right? Then the problem of states interference. Achha, here I am not talking about the states crackdown, like the ones, those FCRA NGOs, which are getting funds from outside, and there has been a bit of a crackdown on them. That is something different. Here I am talking about states interference in those NGOs and excessive interference, very invasive interference in the working of those NGOs who are securing and getting some funds from the government, right? So, the moment you get funds from the government, oh, you can't even imagine the kind of interference the bureaucratic agencies are going to engage in the management and running of your NGO, right? So, states interference in the working of NGOs, especially the ones which are government funded, right? Then yes, corruption in NGOs. Many of the NGOs have fronts for, they have been accused of and sometimes prosecuted also for crimes like money laundering activities, right? Some NGOs have been created only to secure funds from the government possibly, or from the your private corporate sector, or big rich people, big donors, and spending just a part of it on, for the sake of visibility, just spending a part of it on some developmental agenda while pocketing the rest of the money yourself. This is outright corruption, right? Even though NGOs, they always say that, we are being targeted, we are being singled out and targeted by the government just because we are critical of them. On one point, the government is also correct. They say that, there are so many thousands and thousands of NGOs which are actually fronts for money laundering only. And these are corrupt organizations, right? And in fact, what comes to mind is, I think this is a statement which I gave to you earlier also during our lectures on corruption. If I did not, this is as good a time as any, right? So, N. Vittal, there was this person N. Vittal, he is a former Central Vigilance Commissioner. I think I gave you this statement earlier also, but as I said, this is, if I did not, this is as good a time as any. He used to say that corruption in India is principally a result of activities of the Neta, the political leader, politician, the Babu, the bureaucrat, the Lala, the businessman, the Dada, the criminal element, and finally the Jhola, that represents the NGO. Why the Jhola? Because, typical social activist working in an NGO, the stereotype of this person is, the caricature and stereotype of this person is that he is wearing a khadi kurta jeans with kolhapuri chappal, with always having a satchel on his shoulder, and possibly carrying a piece of a small diary and a pen in his upper left pocket, right? So, this is the traditional caricature of a stereotypical caricature of a social activist or an NGO worker, right? So, you can see over here, yes, many NGOs have been accused of and rightly accused of corruption also, some have been prosecuted also. So, Neta, Babu, Lala, Dada, Jhola, the activities of those 5 entities which contribute to corruption in India, N. Vittal was very much right on the mark, right on the dot when he made this statement, correct? So, corruption in NGO. Then look at the next point, domination of elites. The problem is that many of the NGOs, they depend, if they are not getting funds today from the government, they are getting funds from big donors, the elites, right? Big corporate leaders, big businessmen, etc. Those are the elites of society. They are getting money from, donations from. You know what happens is that when an NGO gets a lot of money from one specific very big donor, right? That donor himself, when you get funding from the government interferes in your working. When you get too much funds from one donor, so then that donor also tends to interfere. Then the donor wants you to, he will tell you, okay, if you are doing this project, do it in that area, not in this area. Maybe he has his own agenda in mind, or do this kind of activity, not do that kind of activity, or start something new on lines of what the donor thinks is the best thing to do. So sometimes, when the big donors also, they give a lot of funds to NGOs, they also end up dominating the agenda, the activities, the way in which the NGO will be run. They tend to interfere over there also. So the problem of interference still remains. If you depend it on the government, so then government will interfere a lot in your functioning, bureaucrats will interfere, you will also become overly bureaucratized, rule driven. If you are getting money from corporate houses and especially big donors who give money out of their own pocket, so they will also tend to interfere a lot in your activities, right? But then, look at the next problem. This is something which has to be this is almost very difficult to resolve. Accountability of NGOs. Now see here. NGOs, they collect funds from private donors, corporate houses, etc., maybe from the government also. As far as they are collecting funds from the government, there is a clear logic that if you want to keep on getting government finances, so then you have to submit reports on a regular basis to the government as to what you have achieved. You have to give proper evidence as to what assets you were able to create, what kind of work you did in the rural population, what kind of developmental outcomes you were able to generate, and on the basis of that assessment and evaluation, finally the government gives further extension of finances. So there, some accountability is ensured. But because after all, when you are government funded, you are actually using taxpayers' money. So here the government has to secure accountability, and it does so to an extent. Right. But when you are getting money from, let us say assume you're not getting money from government, or you are not even getting money from big donors. You are getting money through voluntary contributions, small voluntary contributions of 100 rupees, 200 rupees, 1000 rupees, etc., from middle class people who are not even worried and concerned about. They just know that this is a credible. It appears to be a credible NGO. They just want to satisfy their vanity. Ki, look, I have contributed to some social work, so they contribute 200 rupees, 500 rupees, 1000 rupees, maybe as low as 10 rupees also. But when thousands of people contribute even these small amounts, the cumulative collection works out into crores. Right. Now, with these crores of money, which is, mind you, not taxpayers' money, which has not been given to them through the government, it is not even coming from a major donor. I am assuming, hypothetically, money has not come from a major donor. If it comes from a major donor, the donors also keep a watchful eye, a vigilant eye on the NGOs as to how they function, right, and whether they are able to achieve their goals or not. But when these NGOs, which are not getting funds either from big donors or from your government, but they are able to mobilize a lot of resources from the population in general, how do you secure their accountability? Fine. If the NGO has been set up as a cooperative trust or not-for-profit company or a charitable endowment, so then there are proper legal frameworks according to which they have to function. They have to furnish annual returns, etc. Fine, they are furnishing annual returns. But our point is not that. Our point is this, that if this NGO was started with the objective of providing reasonable rates or cheap rural housing to poor people in rural India, whether with the money that they use, were they able to actually meet that end and generate and construct adequate number of houses which should have been constructed with the money they were able to mobilize, right? How to hold them accountable? And let us say, with the money they were able to mobilize, there was a possibility of creating 1000 rural houses and rural dwellings, but they were able to create only 200. Now, in this context, who will hold them accountable? There is no major donor also. There is no government to hold accountable, because this NGO is neither getting funds from major donors or from the government. Now, it's very difficult to hold them accountable. Getting the idea? If there is some pilferage, if there is some corruption in the use of funds, then it is up to the members of the NGOs if they want to file a report on this. And because if they don't file a report about internal corruption, how will the cops or how will the investigative machinery also discover anything about it, right? So this is a big problem, that how to hold the NGOs accountable, not only for in the context of using your resources, but whether they were able to achieve the desired outcomes with which with which in mind that this NGO was actually created. And because they are not using taxpayers' money, if taxpayers' money is used, government is going to interfere and enforce some accountability over there. If you are using money from big donors, big corporate houses, they will also enforce some accountability in terms of what you have been able to achieve. But those NGOs which are generally raising resources from the people, what about such NGOs in terms of whether they were able to achieve their outcomes or not? And if they were not able to, the common man who's giving a donation of 200 rupees, 300 rupees, he's not even that much bothered. He won't even go to the extent of investigating whether that NGO was able to achieve the goals, because he has made a very, very small contribution. So this is a big issue, how to hold the NGOs accountable for their performance. As far as those which are registered properly, those which are legal entities, some kind of accountability framework are there in the laws under which they are registered and set up. If government funding is there, some accountability is there. Big corporate funding, big donor funding is there, some accountability can be enforced. But with big donor funding also comes this problem of domination of elites in their functioning, right? So a mix of, a bit of a mess of all the problems, each problem feeding off into the other. Correct. I hope these points are clear to you. Let's move further. Then look at the next point, absence of a common set of norms for the governance of NGOs, which is correct. As I said that firstly, when you set up an NGO, we answered this question yesterday also, is there a requirement that the NGOs have to be formally registered? No. Like the resident welfare associations, RWAs of various societies, etc., they are not formally registered, they are informal. In fact, if you look at self-help groups also, which is not a typical NGO, it's like an interest group only, but they are also not formally registered, right? But most of the serious NGOs, they do tend to get formally registered. But how? Some NGOs become cooperatives, some NGOs are registered under the Trust Act, some are as charitable endowments, some are registered as religious endowments, some are registered as not-for-profit companies, and each of the laws, when they get registered as various kinds of entities, the laws which govern these specific entities are different. There is a separate law that governs how trusts will be managed, a separate law that governs as to how cooperatives will be run, or another law which talks about how charities are going to be managed, right? So there is an absence, and because this is there, so this creates problems of, again, this also creates problems of accountability. There are so many forms an NGOs can take, and not even counting those who are not even formally registered, right? I am talking about an NGO can be a trust with a different set of norms as to their functioning. It can be a cooperative with a different set of norms, or it can be a charitable endowment, religious endowment, not-for-profit company, each having its own set of legal norms as to how they will operate. This complicates governance, this complicates transparency, this complicates accountability of NGOs. So the absence of a common set of norms, ideally in India, because, and not just in India, world over, now that civil society movement has taken roots, and NGOs have, registered their presence in every democracy in particular in a big way, it is time to, frame a comprehensive law dealing only with NGOs, right? Rather than having different laws under which they are registered, which they have the option to get registered as trusts, cooperatives, not-for-profit companies, have a common comprehensive legal institutional framework according to which every NGO is required to function, right? Then let's come to this last issue, which I'll discuss in detail now, that is government's crackdown. As I said that earlier also, what are the big reasons as to why the governments all over the world, and particularly in those areas, those countries where democracy is not fully mature, like India, why is it that governments all over the world, including governments of immature democracies, they are not very happy with the working of NGOs? Because number one, they represent the voice of informed dissent, which I explained in my last class. Okay. Secondly, many of these NGOs in the fourth generation, they have acquired a new form of, they have acquired a new paradigm of how to, propagate and advocate their agenda, and that is basically social activism. Activism means they engage a lot in something called agitprop. What is agitprop? Agitation and propaganda. The moment they come onto the propaganda area, they participate in media debates, write articles, books, critical commentaries. Then they also engage in your agitation. They are regularly found in Jantar Mantar locations or other important locations where NGOs and other public spirited people, they come onto the streets and question the government, confront the government directly. Now, this is not something which is liked by the government. On the one hand, they are the voice of informed dissent. Genuine NGOs present the truth. In fact, more than media today, it is the NGOs that speak truth to power. And when anybody speaks truth to power, power will never appreciate that. And when you are going to engage in propaganda to influence the opinion of, influence and shape public opinion also, then come out on the streets also engage in agitation, this is going to embarrass the government, right? This is going to put the government in a big dog. That is why governments all over the world, and particularly in the developing world, leaders are never happy with the work of NGOs. And that is why those very restrictive and crippling laws like the FCRA.